However, to decide whether the price is worth paying in terms of the misery and unemployment that it generates. A generation marred in their life chances, mind-boggling borrowing that we will have to repay over years, which will diminish proper investment in public services and industry. All that, and for what? The Secretary of State has told us this week that the average number of deaths is consistent with the long-term average for this time of year. 1,600 people die every day, but COVID is by no means chief amongst their killers. And it's no good to say that, well, every other jurisdiction in the world is following basically the same policy. That would strike me as herd stupidity.
And that provides you that security. Well, no one will criticize you because you're just following everyone else. Well, that's groupthink. And that's a herd stupidity. It just, clicked in my head. And unfortunately, it's just a what you call a soundbite, but it happened to work. It worked for the rest of the speech. I think because people heard the herd immunity, it was the tag on which they can hang the rest of the speech, which went wider into the ways that, I think we've been fooled, or the government has fooled itself, frankly.
It's really powerful, because you talked about in your speech how if we didn't learn the lessons from previous issues, it'll be like a cycle of maybe history repeating itself, and people looking back and thinking, well, what was we doing back then? So
yeah, well, I'm afraid there's a great deal of that goes on, and I don't think that we've, in terms of the modelling that the scientists are using, there's much difference from the modelling that was used in the early 1920s after the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919. We've computerized it all, but actually the basic methodology is the same. I think that's where we've gone wrong. And for the last few pandemics, from BSE to SARS to MERS, there's always been these huge predictions of truly alarming numbers of deaths that then never occur. But nevertheless, because of that alarm, you change policies and you do all sorts of things. And I think that we've done some terrible things by intruding on the liberty and responsibilities of ordinary people in a way that when it's over, governments will bank and say, well, actually, people didn't really object. Indeed, the opinion polls say they would have even endured tougher restrictions. Hey, we can do that when we need to. I think it's a very dangerous thing, a very dangerous lesson that governments will have learned. Closing down, taking away freedom of worship, it just strikes me as extraordinary. And we just shrugged and let it happen.
Mm. Yeah. It's been very tough for many people, including my church. But yeah, there's a lot of issues. And I think I completely agree with you. We shouldn't have just been so easy to give away our liberties, but it also ties in with my next question of the issue of fearmongering. I think that when, there's a lot of stories of, all of these COVID deaths and all of these COVID issues, it can create fear to the point where people comply. Because it's in the media, it's in front of us, so we will get concerned. So it all ties up to my next question, which is how do you think the whole fearmongering concept is affecting people in terms of their mental health? Because it's constantly presented to us. I
mean, I get lots of emails from people who are in terrible fear. you know, it's clear that they need some sort of therapy because, you know, they're terribly frightened even of sending their children to school, when all the evidence shows that actually children are, you know, pretty well immune, and when they aren't immune, they have a very, very mild dose of the disease. But, you know, I get letters from parents saying that they want to keep their children out of school because they don't trust the fact, you know, they think it might be much worse. And clearly the reason for building up that fear at the start and talking about long COVID and talking about the number of deaths and all the rest was to try and get compliance, because many of the restrictions are extraordinarily hard to enforce. But nevertheless, you gain compliance by generating fear. Well, it worked, but I'm afraid it worked too well, because many people living in fear and in anxiety, that is not healthy. And we've seen that toll in mental health. I mean, let's face it, children, particularly young people, have enough on their plate in terms of mental health issues that my generation never had to deal with, in terms of the anxieties generated by social media, which was never a pressure that we had. So we had those difficulties already, and I think we built on them and made it much worse.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a situation of state capture. The government is completely in thrall to a lobby, driving a policy that has manifestly failed. It's failed, or we wouldn't be here yet again. A complete failure. And yet we go through increasing iterations of this policy with ever tighter controls and restrictions in the hope that it might finally work. And then, when there is a possibility, as a consequence of the arrival of the vaccines, the crazed lobby has already begun to signal that the social control won't be over, that some restrictions will remain. Indeed, the chiefs have pointed out that they might have to be reimposed all over again next winter. So, for those colleagues who are contemplating voting for these measures this evening, buoyed up by opinion pollsters telling them that actually the voters are in favour of them, and indeed the voters crave for even tighter restraints on their liberty, I would point out that when the devastating economic consequences of this policy come home to roost, double-dip recession, years of slow growth because firms can't take up new opportunities because they're saddled with debt, those same voters who are so enthusiastic will abandon them, and they'll be back to point a finger of blame. And on that occasion, at least, they'll be right.
Definitely not on mute.
Much worse.
Thank you for that answer. And my next question is, in 2016, you were knighted for parliamentary and political service. What advice would you give to a young person that is keen to get involved in politics? Because you're a prime example of a person that has made a change for the better. And I think that, like, some of the speeches that you've done years from now, people will still be playing them back because some of them are so iconic.
Yeah. I always feel guilty about being knighted. Of course, I'm delighted to accept the honour. There's never any question that I wouldn't accept the honour. But then you see the real heroes in your community, the people who are working tirelessly, helping others, for which there's no recognition, or many people don't even notice what they're doing. That's really building the kingdom. But nevertheless, what would my advice be? My advice to someone who's interested in politics and making a difference is, first of all, choose which party, and you'll know that from simply your own instincts, where you lie in terms of the balance of, or it might just be family. You know, some people always just do what their family has always done. But nevertheless, choose your political party with which you're most comfortable. And join it locally, and so that you're part of that team, part of the people that meet on a Wednesday night or whatever, or will go out leafleting on a wet Saturday morning, you know, because when it comes to you wanting to progress and become a candidate, the people who make those choices will say, oh yeah, he's one of us, he came out with us and helped on such and such and that, or she, she was always, at the meetings and giving useful input. So you build up your networking within the organization. You go to the party conferences, you get yourself noticed, you make a speech, and that's the way you do it. And at one stage you'll get to in front of a selection committee, and the face will either fit or it won't. They'll like you or they won't. And it's no good getting upset. It's the caprice of human nature, when I had, because there's nothing worse than never getting an interview. But once you start getting interviews, start asking for feedback afterwards. If you didn't get the job, ask, how could I improve my presentation or whatever? And I remember being told by one of the people after, he said, what you did was you told us what you believed. Yes, there's room for a bit of that. But what we really want to know is that we're going to like working with you. We want you to come over, not as a, tub thumping politician telling us what you think, but, someone who is actually going to be nice to engage with and go out canvassing with and work for and help. That was the most useful piece of advice I think I got during the entire process. Mr. Nice Guy.
Yeah, it's really encouraging because,
And I think that's something that's generally true, that people need to recognize when they're doing interviews for jobs. Because whenever I've been interviewing and whenever I've been seeking to employ people in my commercial life in various forms, the thing that's uppermost in your mind is how are they going to fit in? Are these people going to be useful members of the team, or are they going to cause us problems? Are there going to be differences of, are there going to be character clashes and that sort of thing? You want someone who's going to move seamlessly into your team and people are going to enjoy working with. And you've got to create that impression in an interview. It makes all the difference.
Well, I really thank you for that, because you just talked about not just politics, but how people can kind of get jobs in different environments as well. So that's really cool. Yeah. I'd also like to say that faith, like during a crisis, plays such an important part. In the war, faith was important. In lots of pandemics, faith was important. So what strategies do you think the government can implement to enable the safe reopening of places of worship?
Well, I think that places of worship are perfectly safe, frankly, and always were. I mean, there may be churches, and you may be a member of one of them, where they're always packed on a Sunday. But most churches have plenty of room to spread the congregation around it. I know that there are many evangelical churches and Adventist churches that are, absolutely thriving, and you can feel the spirit, and they're packed full. But unfortunately, they're not the norm. Most churches in England are pretty empty, and so there's plenty of room. And so I could not understand the need to close them in the first lockdown, or indeed this last lockdown. So I think they're perfectly safe. And of course, I think it's deeply regrettable that we can't sing hymns and really enjoy our worship. But nevertheless, so I don't think that churches are the problem. I think where you'll find the problem is that governments recoil from faith. We don't do that. We don't get involved with that. And I've certainly found that in elements of the civil service. It was something you should keep to yourself as a private matter. And I think that's nonsense. Faith informs all our decision making. What's more, what are you talking about? We're not a secular society like France. The Queen is head of the Church of England, and we have bishops sitting in the House of Lords, and we have an established church. So don't try and exclude religion from the public sphere. It's in the public sphere and has every right to be. And we shouldn't be embarrassed that people explain what their faith is and tell you what their faith is and practice their faith. It's not something we should do in a corner. And I think we're very, very fortunate, because people do write to me and complain to me about being persecuted for their faith in this country. Yes, there are limitations that we need to be aware of and we need to be wary of, but come off it. You know, you only have to look at countries overseas where Christians are in danger of their lives because of their faith, and enjoy what liberty we have.
Yeah, it's really, really powerful what you're saying. It's like all of your speeches, every time I've watched your interviews, you know, the speeches give life to so many young people. You know, during this pandemic, there were so many cases where I spoke to young people in my church, outside my church, experiencing high levels of depression, upset that, you know, they couldn't go to church or see their family. So even all of your points up to here, it's just so powerful, like what you're saying. And even when I play this back to them, it will give them hope and also encourage them to make their voices heard in the political arena. So
yes, well, the way, you know, direct them to the gospel, not to me. You know, just look at that towards the end of John's gospel, there's that magnificent line where Jesus says that, you know, not one of those, that he's ineffectively praying, and he's saying, not one of those you gave to me, Father, will I lose. Yeah, what a promise. None of us will be lost who've been given by the Father to Christ.
That's really powerful. Thank you for saying that. And the last question I'd like to ask you is, what are the two greatest lessons you've learned over the course of your career?
The need for wisdom and the need to take other people's points of view on board and recognize that you don't always get it right. Even when you know you feel passionately about something. Let me give you an example. You know, you may have an argument in the public sphere where you've put yourself in a very prominent position, and then thought about it afterwards and realized you were wrong. And, you know, in order to put that right, you have to lose face. And you'll be, you know, the newspaper will say, oh, he's apologized. He's, you know, think of apologizing and changing your position. If you change your mind because you think you were wrong before, the facts have changed, you want to change, you've just got to see that as a strength rather than a weakness. It's better the earlier you realize that you've made a mistake, to come clean and fess up, than to try carrying on with a position that is increasingly untenable.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. I'd like to thank you for such a phenomenal interview. I'm completely blown away by the answers that you've given, and it also demonstrates the reason why I asked to interview you, because it will be a great interview. Thank you for encouraging us by using the gospel, by using, you know, your own life experiences. I'd just like to also just encourage you on behalf of the young people and just say on behalf of all of them, thank you. Thank you for your speeches.
Well, thank you for all that you're doing and the inspiration that you're spreading amongst your church and your friends and supporters. And good luck, and keep praying. We need it.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks a lot. Cheerio.
Sir Desmond Swayne.
To lift lockdown, will he focus exclusively on the progress of vaccinations of those who are most likely to be hospitalised if infected? Mission creep beyond hospitalisations will inevitably lead to the diminution of our sense of urgency to lift the restrictions, wouldn't it?
My honourable friend is completely right, and he gets to the heart of the problem in the policy that's been announced, the pretend policy that's been announced by the party opposite. Because if you were Madam Deputy Speaker, to interfere with the JCVI 1 to 9 list, which is intended to target those most vulnerable, those most at risk of dying or of hospitalisation. You would, of course, and interpolate it with other people appointed by politicians. You would, of course, take vaccines away from the more vulnerable groups, and as the Honourable Gentleman rightly says, you would delay our ability to move forward out of lockdown. He's spot on.